What happens when a young officer shoves a frail veteran at a bus stop for offering kindness? The town's outrage grows, but no one expects the military's thunderous arrival to turn the tables. The sun was barely up, painting the cracked pavement of Willow Creek's Main Street in hues of gold and shadow. I stood at the corner bus stop, a weathered bench creaking under the weight of years, a flickering streetlight buzzing overhead like a tired old friend who's forgotten how to rest. At 78, I've learned to take mornings slow. My bad knee, a souvenir from a war most folks only read about, doesn't care for haste. In my hand was a paper bag from Millie's Bakery, warm with the scent of fresh donuts, the kind that makes your mouth water before you even open it. I'd bought them for the kids who gather at this stop every morning, a gaggle of teenagers with loud laughs and restless energy. They reminded me of my grandkids, now grown and scattered across the country like leaves in the wind. A small gesture, I thought, to brighten their day. I shuffled toward them, my cane tapping a steady rhythm against the pavement. The kids were huddled near the bench, faces buried in their phones, their voices cutting through the crisp air. One of them, a lanky boy with a baseball cap turned backward, tossed an empty soda can onto the ground with a careless flick. It clattered against the curb, and I felt a familiar tug. Order matters. Always has. I bent down, my knee groaning like an old door hinge, and picked up the can, tossing it into the trash bin a few steps away. "Keep it clean, folks," I said, my voice gravelly but warm, the kind of tone you earn after decades of seeing the world's mess and still trying to tidy it up. The boy in the cap, Ethan Carter, I'd later learn, didn't even look up. "Mind your own business, old man," he said, his words sharp enough to slice through the morning quiet. The others snickered, their eyes darting between their screens and me, like I was some sideshow. I've faced worse than a teenager's sneer, jungles thick with danger, nights lit by gunfire, but there's a peculiar sting to being dismissed by kids who don't know the weight of a single day you've lived. I held up the bag, offering a smile that felt heavier than it should. "Brought you all some donuts. Figured you might be hungry before school." Ethan's eyes flicked up, his lip curling. "We don't need your charity, Grandpa. Why don't you shuffle back to wherever you came from?" His friends laughed, a chorus of mockery that made my chest tighten. Charity? I'd fought for their right to stand here, free and careless, but I swallowed the thought. No use preaching to those who aren't listening. "Suit yourselves," I said, keeping my voice steady, though I could feel the heat of indignation creeping up my neck. There's a saying from my army days, you don't win by shouting louder, you win by standing taller. So I stood, bag in hand, waiting for the bus. That's when the police cruiser rolled up, its lights flashing once, a quick pulse that felt like a warning shot. Officer Derek Malone stepped out, all broad shoulders and buzz cut, his scowl carved deep enough to cast its own shadow. I've seen that look before, on young lieutenants who thought authority was a club to swing, not a responsibility to carry. The kids straightened up, their bravado fading like mist. I nodded, polite as always. "Morning, officer," I said, my voice calm, though my grip on the bag tightened. Derek's eyes swept over the scene, lingering on me like I was a problem to be solved. "What's going on here?" he barked, his tone assuming trouble before he even heard a word. Ethan jumped in, quick as a snake. "This guy's hassling us, officer, telling us what to do, waving his bag around like he's some big shot." The lie hit me like a punch to the gut. Hassling? I'd picked up their trash and offered them breakfast. The other kids nodded, their faces a mix of mischief and false innocence, like they'd rehearsed this act. I took a breath, steadying myself. "That's not true," I said, keeping my voice even, though I could feel the eyes of the gathering crowd. Shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, a jogger slowing to watch. I just cleaned up some litter and offered them donuts. No harm meant. Derek stepped closer, his hand resting on his belt, fingers brushing the holster like a subtle threat. "You causing trouble, sir?" he asked, the word "sir" dripping with disdain, like he was spitting it out rather than saying it. I've heard that tone before, from men who think age is a weakness, not a testament. "No trouble, officer," I said, meeting his gaze. "Just trying to do something kind." The air grew thick, the kind of tension you feel before a storm breaks. Derek's impatience was palpable, his jaw tight as he gestured toward the street. "Move along then. This isn't a soup kitchen. People are trying to get to work." The kid snickered again, Ethan's smirk widening like he'd won some prize. I felt a familiar heat in my chest. Not anger exactly, but the weight of being reduced to nothing. A nobody in a town I'd called home for decades. I'd carried shrapnel in my leg since '67, earned a silver star I never bragged about, and here I was, being told to scat like a stray dog. "I'm just waiting for the bus," I said, pointing to the timetable on the rusted pole. "It's due in 5 minutes." My voice was firm, but I kept it respectful. You don't survive war by picking fights you can't win, but you don't survive by backing down either. Derek's face hardened, his eyes narrowing to slits. I said, "Move along," he repeated, stepping into my space, close enough that I could smell the coffee on his breath. Before I could respond, his hand shot out, shoving my shoulder. It wasn't a hard push, but it caught me off balance, my bad leg buckling. The paper bag slipped from my hand, hitting the pavement with a soft thud, donuts spilling out, some crushed underfoot. A gasp came from across the street. A woman named Linda Harper, a cashier from the diner, her face a mask of shock. The kids burst into laughter, one of them pulling out a phone to snap a picture, the flash like a jab to my pride. I caught myself, leaning on my cane, my heart pounding not from fear, but from the sheer wrongness of it all. I looked at Derek, my eyes locking onto his, and for a moment, the world slowed. The hum of traffic, the rustle of leaves, the kids' laughter fading into a dull roar. I've stared down worse than this. Men with guns, not just badges, but this felt personal, a betrayal of something I'd fought for. "You don't want to make this worse," Derek said, his voice low, almost a growl, pointing down the street. "Last chance. Walk away." Linda crossed the street, her steps quick, her voice trembling with outrage. "Hey, that's not right," she called, her hands on her hips. "He didn't do anything wrong, and you know it." The crowd grew, shopkeepers pausing, passers-by turning, their murmurs like a rising tide. Ethan lingered, his smirk faltering as the mood shifted, but he still tossed out a taunt. "Better luck next time, old-timer." I raised a hand to Linda, signaling I was okay, though the humiliation burned like a coal in my chest. I bent down, slow and deliberate, picking up the crushed bag, the donuts now smeared with dirt. "I'll wait for the next bus," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime. Derek smirked, climbing back into his cruiser. "Smart choice," he muttered, the engine roaring as he pulled away. Linda approached, her eyes soft with sympathy. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Grayson," she said. "That was wrong, all of it." I nodded, managing a faint smile. "I've seen worse, Linda," I said, though the words felt hollow. I boarded the bus when it arrived, taking a seat at the back, the bag still in my hand, a reminder of a kindness turned to dust. As the bus pulled away, I saw Linda on her phone, her fingers flying, no doubt telling someone what she'd seen. The crowd was still buzzing, their voices carrying a mix of anger and disbelief. I leaned back, my thoughts drifting to battles long past, to moments when respect was earned through blood and grit. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The bus rattled through Willow Creek, its engine coughing like it was as tired as I felt. I sat near the back, the crumpled paper bag from Millie's bakery resting on my lap, its edges worn from my grip. The donuts inside were ruined, smeared with dirt from the pavement where they'd spilled after Officer Derek Malone's shove. That moment at the bus stop played over in my mind. The kids' laughter, Ethan Carter's sneer, the officer's hand on my shoulder like I was some vagrant to be swept away. I've faced worse in my 78 years. Bullets whistling past, nights spent in mud-soaked trenches. But there's a peculiar ache to being dismissed in your own town, where folks should know better. I stared out the window. The storefronts of Main Street blurring past, their faded signs a reminder of how time moves on, even if respect doesn't always follow. I was headed to the Willow Creek Community Center, a squat brick building that's been my second home for years. Twice a week, I teach history to a group of kids, bright-eyed, curious ones who remind me why I keep showing up. Today, I'd planned to tell them about 67, about the men I pulled from a burning chopper under fire, not for medals, but because it was right. The bag in my hand wasn't just trash. It was a symbol of what I'd tried to do this morning. Something kind, something small. I hadn't thrown it away. Maybe I wanted to hold on to the weight of that moment, to remind myself why I don't give up. The bus lurched to a stop at the town square, and I stepped off, my cane tapping the pavement, my bad knee grumbling with every step. The square was alive with the hum of a farmer's market setting up nearby, tables piled with apples, pumpkins, and homemade pies, the air thick with the scent of coffee and fresh flowers. Families milled about, their laughter mingling with the calls of vendors. It was the kind of scene that usually lifted my spirits, a reminder that Willow Creek still had heart. But today, my heart felt heavy, bruised by the morning's injustice. I adjusted my worn leather jacket, squared my shoulders, and headed toward the community center, determined to shake off the bus stop and focus on the kids. Inside, the center was a whirlwind of noise. Kids darting through the halls, their sneakers squeaking on the tiled floors, parents chatting in clusters. I made my way to the small classroom where I've taught for nearly a decade, the walls lined with faded maps and photos from my old lessons. But as I reached the door, a sharp voice stopped me cold. "Excuse me, sir. You can't just walk in here." It was Karen Wheeler, the new assistant director, a woman in her late 40s with a clipboard clutched like a shield and a face pinched tight with suspicion. I'd met her once, but her eyes scanned me like I was a stranger, lingering on my jacket, my cane, and that damned crumpled bag. "I'm Walter Grayson," I said, keeping my voice steady, though I could feel the sting of her tone. "I'm here for the history class. Been teaching it since 15. I offered a polite nod, the kind you give when you're trying to keep things civil, even when you feel a storm brewing inside. Karen's lips pursed, her pen tapping her clipboard like a judge's gavel. "I don't have you on the schedule," she said, her voice clipped, as if I'd wandered in off the street with no business being there. "And we don't allow food in the classrooms. You'll need to leave that bag outside." Her eyes flicked to the paper bag, her nose wrinkling like it was something offensive. I glanced down at it, the faint grease stains a reminder of the morning's failure. "It's just an empty bag," I said, my tone calm but firm, though I could feel my patience fraying. "And I've been teaching this class every Wednesday and Friday for years. Ask Mr. Thompson, the director. He'll vouch for me." Karen's expression didn't soften. "Mr. Thompson's on leave, and I'm in charge now," she said, her voice rising just enough to draw eyes from the parents nearby. "I don't know you, and I can't let just anyone walk in here with a room full of kids." The implication hung heavy, that I was some kind of threat, a nobody with a cane and a bag. I felt the weight of the bus stop all over again, the same dismissal, the same assumption that age makes you less. "Well," I said, a wry edge creeping into my voice, "I suppose I could be a master criminal, but I left my disguise at home." A few parents chuckled, but Karen's face tightened. "This isn't a joke," she snapped, flipping through her clipboard. "We're expecting a guest speaker today, a real historian from the university. You'll have to come back another time." The word real cut deep, like a blade slipped between ribs. I've spent years sharing stories that aren't in books, stories of men who didn't come home, of moments that shaped me. And here was this woman, with her clipboard and her protocols, telling me I wasn't enough. "I've got ID," I said, reaching for my wallet, my fingers brushing the faded military ID I've carried since the war. But Karen waved a hand, dismissing me like a fly. "That's not the point. You're not on my list, and I don't have time for this." Her voice was loud now, drawing more attention. Parents whispered, their eyes darting between us. I could feel the room closing in, the same public scrutiny I'd faced at the bus stop. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said, my voice low, but there was a steel in it, forged in places Karen would never understand. "Those kids in there know me. They're expecting me." Karen's eyes narrowed, her authority challenged. "I said no," she said, gesturing to a security guard near the entrance, a young man named Tyler Brooks, barely out of high school, his uniform hanging loose on his frame. "Tyler, escort this man out." Tyler approached, his steps hesitant, his eyes avoiding mine. "Sir, you need to leave," he said, his voice soft, almost apologetic, like he knew this wasn't right. I stood my ground, my cane planted firm. "I'm not causing trouble, son," I said to Tyler, my gaze steady. "I just want to teach my class." The hallway was quieter now, the kids peeking out from the classroom. Sophie Miller, a bright girl with pigtails, spotted me and lit up. "Mr. Grayson," she called, her voice cutting through the tension. "You're here!" Lucas Reed, a lanky boy with a quick grin, joined her. "You gonna tell us about the chopper today?" Karen spun toward them, her face flushing. "Back inside, both of you!" she snapped. "This man is not teaching today." She turned back to me, her voice rising to a near shout. "You're disrupting our schedule. If you don't leave, I'll call the police." The word police hit like a cold wind, stirring memories of Derek Malone's shove, the spilled donuts, the laughter. I could feel the eyes of the crowd. Parents, kids, even a few vendors who'd wandered in from the market. "No need for that," I said, my voice calm but carrying a weight I hadn't felt in years. "I'll go, but I'll be back to sort this out." I looked at Sophie and Lucas, offering a small smile. "See you soon, all right?" Sophie's face fell, her eyes wide with disappointment. Lucas muttered something, glaring at Karen. As I turned to leave, a voice cut through the hall. "What's going on here?" It was Linda Harper, the cashier from the diner, her arms crossed, her face flushed with the same indignation I'd seen at the bus stop. She'd come to drop off flyers for a charity event and spotted me through the glass doors. "This man's a veteran," she said, her voice loud enough to turn heads. "He's been teaching here forever. Why are you treating him like this?" Karen's expression hardened. "This is none of your business, ma'am," she said, her tone icy. "We have protocols." "He's not authorized." "Authorized?" Linda's voice rose, sharp and unyielding. "He's a hero, not some stranger. You're kicking him out because he's not on your little list?" The parents murmured, the kids clustered closer, and I felt the weight of their support, a flicker of warmth in the cold storm of the day. But Karen wasn't backing down. "Tyler, now!" she said, her voice trembling with anger. Tyler hesitated, his hand hovering near his radio, his eyes flicking to me with a mix of guilt and uncertainty. I raised a hand, stopping him. "No need, son," I said, my voice steady. "I'm going." I walked out, the bag still in my hand, the crowd parting as I passed. Their whispers followed me, a mix of sympathy and outrage. Outside, the market was in full swing, but I barely saw it. I stood by the curb, my mind racing. First the bus stop, now this. It wasn't just a bad day. It was a pattern, a world that looked at age and saw weakness. Caleb Foster, a young vendor from the market, approached, his face creased with concern. "Mr. Grayson, you okay?" he asked. "I heard what happened." "That's not right." I nodded, my expression tight. "Just a misunderstanding," I said, though we both knew it was more. Caleb pulled out his phone. "I'm telling folks about this," he said. "People need to know." I didn't respond, but as I walked away, I felt the stirrings of something bigger. Willow Creek was small, and word traveled fast. This wasn't over. I stood at the curb outside the Willow Creek Community Center, the crumpled paper bag from Millie's Bakery still in my hand, its weight a stubborn reminder of the morning's wounds. The farmer's market hummed around me, vendors hawking their wares, kids darting through the crowd with sticky fingers, the air thick with the scent of apples and fresh bread. But I felt like a ghost, detached from the bustle, my thoughts tangled in the indignities of the day. Ethan Carter's sneer at the bus stop, Officer Derek Malone's shove, Karen Wheeler's dismissal in the place I'd poured my heart into for years. At 78, I've learned to carry pain quietly. But this wasn't just pain. It was a betrayal, a world that looked at my gray hair and cane and saw nothing worth respecting. I adjusted my leather jacket, its worn seams like old battle scars, and took a deep breath, steadying the storm inside me. Caleb Foster, the young vendor who'd seen the mess unfold, was still nearby, his fingers flying over his phone. "Mr. Grayson," he said, his voice urgent, "I posted about what happened, both at the bus stop and here. Folks are furious. It's blowing up online." His eyes were bright, with a mix of awe and anger, like he'd stumbled into something bigger than himself. I nodded, my lips tight. Social media wasn't my world. I'd rather face a room full of kids than a screen full of strangers. But I appreciated his fire. "Let it be, Caleb," I said, my voice low, almost a whisper. No sense stirring the pot. But the pot was already boiling, and I could feel it in the air, the way the crowd's murmurs grew sharper, their glances lingering on me with something like pity. Across the street, Linda Harper, the diner cashier who'd stood up for me twice today, was on her phone, her voice sharp as she spoke to someone I couldn't hear. "Sarah, you need to get this in the paper," she said, her hands gesturing wildly. "This man's a hero, and they're treating him like dirt." Her words carried across the square, turning heads among the market-goers. A few parents from the community center lingered nearby, their faces creased with concern, their whispers a quiet chorus of outrage. I didn't want their pity, but I couldn't deny the warmth of knowing someone cared. Inside the center, Karen Wheeler was still holding court, her voice shrill as she tried to calm the storm she'd started. I could hear her through the open door, addressing the parents like a politician caught in a scandal. "It was a scheduling issue," she said, her tone defensive. "We're bringing in a qualified speaker, a professional." The kids weren't having it. Sophie Miller's voice rang out, small but fierce. "Why can't Mr. Grayson teach? He's the best!" Lucas Reed chimed in, his teenage bravado cutting through. "Yeah, he tells real stories, not boring book stuff." I smiled despite myself, a flicker of pride warming my chest. Those kids, they were why I kept coming back, why I hadn't given up after the bus stop. But Karen wasn't budging. "Back to your seats!" she snapped, her authority fraying like cheap thread. I could picture her clutching that clipboard, her knuckles white, as if it could shield her from the truth. I didn't want to go back inside, didn't want another fight. I'd spent my life standing tall, but there's a weariness that comes with being pushed one too many times. I was about to walk away when a deep rumble cut through the market's noise. A black SUV pulling into the lot, its tires crunching gravel like a drum roll. The door swung open, and out stepped Colonel James Randall, his salt and pepper beard catching the sunlight, his posture as commanding as it was 40 years ago when he led our platoon through hell. James and I had seen things most folks couldn't imagine, jungles that swallowed men whole, nights where survival was a coin toss. We'd stayed in touch, bound by a loyalty that doesn't fade. He'd been at a veterans meeting nearby when Linda's friend at the newspaper called, tipping him off about the bus stop and the center. His eyes found me in an instant, and he strode over, his boots clicking with purpose. "Walter Grayson," he said, his voice warm but edged with steel. "What's this nonsense about you getting pushed around?" I blinked, caught off guard. "James, how'd you get here so fast?" I managed a faint smile, though my voice was heavy with the day's weight. "Just a rough morning, that's all." "A rough morning?" James's brow furrowed, his eyes flashing with the kind of fire I remembered from the battlefield. "I hear a cop laid hands on you, and some bureaucrat kicked you out of your own class. That's not a morning, Walter, that's a damn disgrace." His voice rose, drawing eyes from the market crowd. Caleb, still hovering nearby, perked up, his phone still in hand. "I saw it," he said to James. "Posted it online. People are sharing it like wildfire." James's jaw tightened, his gaze never leaving me. "You carried half our platoon through worse than this, Walter. You don't get to be treated like trash in your own town." He turned to Caleb. Keep spreading the word, son. This needs to be heard. Then he looked at me, his voice firm. We're going inside to fix this. You with me? I hesitated, my pride wrestling with exhaustion. I don't want a scene, James, I said, my voice low. I just wanted to teach my kids. You will, he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. But not before we set this right. He gestured for me to follow, and I did, my cane tapping a steady rhythm, Linda falling in step beside us, her face set with determination. The crowd parted as we approached the center, their whispers growing louder, a tide of curiosity and anger. Inside, Karen was still talking, her voice faltering as we entered. The room fell silent, the air thick with anticipation. Her eyes widened at James, his presence filling the space like a storm cloud. "Who are you?" she demanded, clutching her clipboard like a lifeline. "Colonel James Randall, U.S. Army, retired," James said, his voice calm but cutting, each word landing like a hammer. "And this man," he gestured to me, "is Sergeant Walter Grayson, Silver Star recipient for pulling 3 men from a burning chopper under enemy fire. He's been teaching here for years, and you decided he's not authorized?" The room gasped, parents exchanging glances, their murmurs rising. Sophie and Lucas, peering from the classroom door, grinned wide. "Told you Mr. Grayson's a badass," Lucas whispered, earning a sharp look from Sophie. Karen's face drained of color, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. I didn't know," she stammered. "He wasn't on the schedule." "You didn't ask," James cut in, his voice a blade. "You saw an old man with a cane and assumed he was nothing, and I hear he was assaulted by a police officer this morning too. Is this how Willow Creek honors its heroes?" The parents erupted in whispers, their eyes shifting to me with a mix of awe and shame. Linda stepped forward, her voice ringing out. "I saw it at the bus stop. Officer Malone shoved him, just for offering donuts to some kids. It's all over town now. People are livid." Her words were like fuel on a fire, the crowd's murmurs growing into a low roar. Then came a sound that stopped us all. A deep rumble from outside, like thunder rolling in. Heads turned as 2 military jeeps pulled into the parking lot, their engines growling. Captain Emily Carter stepped out, her uniform crisp, her face stern. She'd served under James years ago, and when he'd called, she'd insisted on coming. A squad of National Guard soldiers followed, their boots hitting the ground in unison. The sight sent a shockwave through the crowd, vendors and parents craning their necks to see. Emily strode into the center, her eyes locking onto me. "Sergeant Grayson," she said, snapping a salute so sharp it cut through the tension. "We heard you were having trouble. We're here to ensure that doesn't happen again." The soldiers behind her stood tall, their presence a silent promise. I returned the salute, my hand steady despite the lump in my throat. I hadn't asked for this, hadn't wanted a spectacle. But seeing them there, my people, my family, it stirred something deep, a pride I'd buried long ago. The room erupted in cheers, Sophie clapping wildly, Lucas pumping his fist. The parents joined in, their applause like a wave crashing over Karen, who stood frozen, her clipboard slipping to the floor with a clatter. I'm sorry," she stammered, her face flushed with humiliation. "I didn't know who he was." "You didn't care to find out," James said, his voice quiet but piercing. "That's the problem." Outside, Caleb was live streaming, his voice trembling with excitement. "This is unreal," he said to his viewers. "They're standing up for Mr. Grayson. This is what respect looks like." Emily turned to me, her eyes soft but resolute. "Sergeant, your class is waiting. You ready?" I looked at the kids, their faces bright with anticipation, and nodded, a small smile breaking through. "Yes, ma'am," I said, my voice steady. I walked into the classroom, the kids swarming around me, their voices a joyful chaos. Karen stood rooted, her authority shattered, as the parents and soldiers watched in silence. As I began my lesson, sharing stories of courage and sacrifice, the room felt alive, charged with something sacred. Outside, I heard the screech of tires, Derek Malone's cruiser pulling up, summoned by the commotion. James met him at the door, his voice low and unyielding. "We'll be talking about what you did this morning, officer. Expect a call from your chief." I didn't see Derek's face fall. Didn't hear the crowd's disapproval grow louder. I was with my kids, telling them about a young soldier who carried his friends to safety, never asking for thanks. When the lesson ended, Sophie handed me a drawing, a soldier with a silver star, her pencil strokes careful and proud. I took it, my throat tight, and stepped outside. The crowd erupted in applause, a sound that washed over me like rain after a drought. I raised a hand, not for attention, but to quiet them. "Thank you," I said, my voice carrying a lifetime's weight. Then I walked away, my limp more pronounced, but my head held high, the drawing tucked inside my jacket, next to my heart.